we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh.
The US is finally taking the clearest action for Ukraine.
But Mr. Trump said great progress had been made.
Mr. Putin, will you agree to a ceasefire?
We had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to.
This new move is neither a transfer of weapons nor a ceasefire. It is a comprehensive security guarantee. Moreover, it is similar to the 5 points of NATO. This statement has been made so clearly for the first time by the US. Now the situation is very tense. The Ukrainian army is on the brink of collapse. But Europe and the US are rolling out a powerful new support formula. Leaders are flocking to Washington. Meanwhile, Putin is nervous, as the Russian army's ability to hold out under current conditions is dwindling. And Putin had an ironic meeting with Trump in Alaska. While Putin was greeted by the US military show in Alaska, he and Trump posed as if they were old friends. However, the images that emerged showed Trump with clear psychological superiority. Putin was welcomed with red carpets and the US presidential vehicle, but at the same time, F-22 fighter jets and B-2 bomber fleets were flying right in front of his eyes. In any case, this summit was truly a historic turning point, because after the Alaska meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, security guarantees were put on the table in a much tougher manner. So, will this promise really produce deterrence, or is it just an inadequate move? Volodymyr Zelensky is coming to Washington to seek the answer to this question. European leaders are joining him, indicating that the guarantee design will be shaped by the transatlantic anchor. A shift in Trump's rhetoric was also noted. The line, prioritizing a ceasefire, has given way to talk of a permanent agreement. This shift does not reduce tensions on the ground, but rearranges the agenda for negotiations. Putin's territorial demands in Donbass and Kiev's objection to them are setting the tone for tough negotiations. Can Article 5-like guarantees produce NATO influence without NATO membership? The answer to this question lies in the architecture of implementation. Let's start with the bare facts. The US envoy says that Russia has accepted that the US and its European allies will provide NATO-style protection to Ukraine. The statement implies that the decision is at the political principle level and that the details will be worked out in talks in Washington.
We agreed on much more robust security guarantees. The Russians agreed on enshrining legislatively.
The US's prepared message from Berlin also confirms the European side of the framework. On the Kiev front, the main red line is being maintained. Zelensky rejected the offer to hand over Donbass. This rejection requires that the guarantees be based on a model of deterrence while preserving territory, rather than territory in exchange for guarantees. So what could and could not be Article 5 like? First of all, this expression is not an exact copy of the collective defense provision in Article 5 of the NATO treaty. One cannot have automatic NATO obligations without being a NATO member. Therefore, what is being discussed is a non-NATO but NATO-compatible deterrence package. The first component of this set could be a rapid consultation and automatic support mechanism. The provision derived from the G7 framework, which states, consultation and provision of necessary support within 24 hours, is on the table as a legal template. The second component is to create a multi-layered umbrella for air and missile defense. This is possible with ground-based systems, airborne early warning, and network-centric command and control. The third component is a continuous flow of ammunition and spare parts. This requires guaranteed production capacity and advanced purchase agreements. The fourth component is linking sanctions and financial deterrence to automatic triggers in a snapback style. If the attack resumes, energy and financial measures are automatically activated. The fifth component is direct investment and joint production in Ukraine's defense industry. This reduces the cost of the war and decreases dependence. The most controversial aspect of the package is how to define the threshold for military intervention. The key question is whether it should be indirect intervention, direct deployment of forces, or a scheme that includes both. Here, the fundamental difference that should not be confused with NATO becomes clear. NATO's Article 5 defines the principle of collective defense. In the case of the EU, however, partners determine the type and scale of their response according to their own domestic laws. Thus, bindingness is not automatic, but the political cost may become automatic. This is why the political balance in Washington is critical. The question of whether to opt for an agreement requiring Senate approval or a set of executive agreements is on the agenda. The executive format is fast but less durable. The agreement format is more binding but has a higher political threshold. This distinction in US domestic politics directly affects the credibility of deterrence. Rubio's emphasis on both sides having to make concessions indicates the political orientation as the package is being drafted. This rhetoric may not mean territorial concessions, but it points to a search for mutual steps in the text. The picture is becoming clearer on the European front. Chancellor Merz said he was ready to participate in US security guarantees, and Berlin's line appears to be in sync with Washington's. The fact that European leaders are accompanying Washington strengthens the image of a coalition and puts the brakes on Kiev being pushed into a lonely negotiation. The NATO line, however, is two-tiered. The alliance confirms that Ukraine's path to NATO remains open after the war. It sees bilateral security agreements as a bridge during the transition period. If the bridge is not built solidly, the parties will revert to old habits at the first sign of trouble. How does Moscow read this picture? The first sign is the leaks from behind the scenes regarding the territory, NATO commitments, and sanctions easing, package after Alaska. According to the claims, while the demands for Donetsk and Luhansk continue, the withdrawal of the NATO application and the recognition of the de facto status of Crimea are being sought. Additionally, symbolic issues such as language and the church have been brought to the table. These are far below Kiev's threshold for acceptance and are politically unfeasible. A strong consensus has formed in Ukrainian politics, rejecting territorial concessions, and this position has been confirmed in public statements. Therefore, the only real meaning of the guarantees is the signal that if Russia attempts a new attack, the price will be paid by the big players. NATO's view is also divisive. The alliance's official line is that Ukraine's path to NATO membership should remain open in the post-war period. Similar guarantees do not replace NATO membership. They serve as a temporary bridge. Therefore, the text Washington will draft should be in a bridge commitment format. Let us move on to concrete steps. The first step is the trigger consultation clause, a condition for automatic assembly within 24 hours in the event of an attack or large-scale missile strike is stipulated. The second step is the automatic military supply switch. Once the defined threshold is crossed, air defense, long-range munitions, and electronic warfare packages are automatically dispatched. The third step is the continuous operation of the Common Air Picture and Integrated Air Missile Defense Network. This network is compatible with NATO, but operates separately from NATO's decision-making mechanism. The fourth step is pre-deployment and pre-stockpiling. Spare parts and ammunition depots are maintained at appropriate border points, and training continues on a rotational basis. The fifth step is automatic economic retaliation. In the event of a repeat attack, pre-programmed disruptors are activated in energy shipping and financial flows. The sixth step is the allocation of rehabilitation and reconstruction funds to defense civilian dual-use investments. This increases resilience and reduces costs. This scenario directly involves Europe's three heavyweights, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, in the implementation phase. Regardless of the fate of the framework in Washington, the burden that the London, Berlin, Paris trio will bear in both military procurement and long-term financing is already clear. The United Kingdom expanded its aid items throughout 2025 on the basis of the UK-Ukraine Security Cooperation Agreement signed in 2024. According to an official information note, the goal is to ensure the continuity of the fighting force through training, air defense, long-range precision strikes, intelligence surveillance, and production partnerships. This acts as a resilience umbrella prior to NATO membership. Regardless of whether a Article 5-like formula emerges in Washington, London's policy apparatus is ready. Germany is decisive on two fronts. The first is the budget scale. Direct military aid and industrial orders allocated to Ukraine in the 2025 calendar have brought Germany close to becoming the #1 source of funding in Europe. Berlin is pursuing a clear production order strategy this year for Patriot architecture, air defense ammunition, armored platforms, and ammunition belts. The second is the financing technique. With the Pearl, Purchases for Ukraine by Replace and License mechanism announced on August 13th, Berlin has combined the methods of replacing every system that comes out of its own inventory with a new one, and direct supply from the manufacturer to Ukraine, in a pool, thereby accelerating the order replacement cycle. This provides a technical anchor for Europe's reflex to secure orders in the face of possible political turmoil in the US. France, meanwhile, entered 2025 in a more systematic manner through the bilateral security agreement signed in 2024 and the twin agreement concluded with Germany on the same day. The €3 billion package announced by Paris in 2024 is geared more toward air defense, cruise missiles, and artillery ammunition in 2025. The language of these agreements clearly reflects the intention to establish a binding guarantee regime in the short to medium term, while signaling NATO membership as the ultimate goal. Therefore, the dichotomy between NATO or guarantees is not read as either-or in Paris, but as a sequential ladder. Where is the line of concession? Is therefore a critical question. Two elements stand out here, pointing to a red line in practice. No territorial concessions will be imposed, and the ceasefire should not be a freeze that legitimizes Russian occupation lines. This interpretation has a ready counterpart in Europe, the G7 Joint Statement, which has been in effect since 2024, and its versions converted into bilateral agreements, repeatedly reiterate the phrase, Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Despite differences in tone between the London-Berlin-Paris trio, the line of no-land concessions is shared. The fact that US officials left the door open to NATO-like guarantees, and that European leaders gave their simultaneous support for this, became clear at this very point. So what will the United Kingdom do? London is moving forward on two tracks. The first is to continue filling in the details of the bilateral agreement, securing stock and production slots for the second half of 2025 for Storm Shadow/Scalp class ammunition, air defense, training and maritime security. The second is to secure advanced ties to the US supply chain. The UK is accelerating joint projects with US manufacturers and moving toward a pre-financing and licensing approach that guarantees delivery despite the US domestic political rhythm. So, how is Germany aligning itself? Three messages stood out in Berlin's 2025 profile. First, the scale of aid and industrial capacity are being expanded together. Patriot, Iris-T, SLM, SLS, Jeopard ammunition, 155 mm production lines, and maintenance and repair stations are being managed as a single ecosystem. Second, the PURL model brings together the formulas of replacing the outgoing system with a new one, and direct supply through licensing under the same roof, creating structural speed, both closing Germany's own defense gap and ensuring serial flow to Ukraine. Third, political language. Although Berlin still says that NATO membership is difficult while the war is ongoing, it now views the idea of a security regime as a means of generating resilience. Merz's emphasis on part of the US guarantee in Washington is a sign of this transformation. Where does France fit into this formation? For Paris, the main equation is twofold. Part 1. Translating the bilateral agreement into action. Scalp EG flow, Crotal Mistral layers, Caesar execution, and new line orders. Part 2. Bringing Europe's strategic autonomy rhetoric into line with the security regime. Paris is defending a European core model that does not replace NATO but accelerates Ukraine. If Washington's line hardens, it calls for coordination. If it softens, it calls for resilience, not replacement. This flexibility is already present in the language of the bilateral agreement. So how are financing and sanctions taking shape? On the one hand, the EU's multi-year Ukraine facility, a package worth around €50 billion, is supporting Kyiv's macro-financial stability and reconstruction projects. On the other hand, new ideas such as weapons for debt aim to pre-commit European capital to US defense industry orders. When these two channels work together, European guarantees are placed under Washington's guarantee. In other words, the political text and the factory floor are brought onto the same page. On the sanctions front, the 18th package, closing back doors via Russia and Belarus, imposing a total transaction ban on certain banks, and expanding the scope of restricted technology items, functions as the financial arm of the guarantee debate. Policy notes summarizing Brussels' legal changes show that the transition from a messaging ban to a transaction ban directly cuts off commercial channels and introduces new powers for circulation export controls. Thus, while the guarantee promises military logistical speed, Sanctions continuously raise the cost of supplies for the other side. This dual approach locks in two stages: deterrence plus cost imposition. So how does the EU, UK, Germany trio view the US position? The main idea is clear. Keep the US on board, place orders in advance, and align the legal language. Berlin's PURL model concretizes the Article 5-like trigger logic currently being discussed in Washington on the supply and production side. It establishes infrastructure for a missile air defense parts triad that will automatically kick in the event of a violation. Paris, meanwhile, is pairing the bilateral agreement with the European industrial chain to weave a framework that is strong with the US, sustainable alone. All of this looks strong on paper, but there are three critical risks. The first is the level of legal binding force. Executive agreements are vulnerable to government changes. The second is Europe's force allocation policy. Parliamentary approval processes can slow down the pace of rapid intervention. Third, Moscow's grey zone tactics. It may try to stay below the threshold with cyber, energy, and sabotage tactics. All three capitals know this. The political rhythm in Washington can change every year, but the order stock license triad produces an unchanging guarantee. These risks require that the automatic aspects of the guarantee be more clearly spelled out. Will an Article 5-like umbrella accelerate the path to NATO membership, or will it turn it into a temporary parking lot? This is a matter that will be determined by the language and timelines of the text. Let's consider the implications on the ground. The permanence of medium and long-range layers in air defense reduces the effectiveness of Russian missile UAV pressure. The security of logistics lines increases, and industrial infrastructure suffers less damage. If the flow of long-range strike capabilities continues, deep supply and command nodes will be suppressed. A maritime security partnership in the Black Sea makes port traffic more predictable. The sum of these factors increases the cost of Moscow's playing for time strategy. For Moscow, the equation is simple. If the guarantee text produces automatic and concrete results in the event of a repeat attack, deterrence becomes real. If it contains only nice words, it will be tested. If tested, the political lifespan of the text will be shortened. Therefore, the degree of automaticity is the main bargaining chip in the talks in Washington. Europe's role is crucial here. If leaders who stand together politically also increase coordination in practice, the umbrella's wind resistance will increase. NATO, meanwhile, has two goals. One is to build a solid bridge for today. The second is to keep the path to membership open for tomorrow. Now let's look at the benefit-risk balance from Kiev's perspective. The benefit is the continuity of air defense and ammunition flows. This means protecting cities and allowing the front line to breathe. The benefit is that production partnerships will expand local capacity. This means less dependence on external shocks. The benefit is that the political umbrella will increase Moscow's cost calculations. This makes a new large-scale attack less rational. The risk is that the guarantee will remain empty. The Budapest feeling could generate new insecurity in society. The risk is that pressure for guarantees in exchange for territory will return. Zelensky's clear line of refusal is the main safeguard against this risk. The risk is that the NATO process will be postponed. The NATO line is clear for the post-war period, but deterrence must not be allowed to falter during this process. Europe's position on the line of concession. No territory, no freeze. It appears that European leaders entered the talks in Washington with the phrase Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that Zelensky clearly conveyed the message, "We will not surrender Donbass." This language is consistent with the logic of the guarantee regime of automatic response to violations. The debate is about methods and pace. Principles are not up for discussion. In terms of their view of the US, the UK is more optimistic aggressive, Germany more order-focused, and France emphasizes coordinated autonomy. None of the three find a security architecture separate from the US realistic, but they also do not want a scenario that is dependent on the US and relegates European industry to a secondary role. That is why the Article 5-like debate in Washington is gaining acceptance, while the Brussels-Berlin-Paris axis is keeping the order stock production triad in its own hands. This is how the balance is being established. The guarantee or NATO debate has moved beyond the either-or equation. Today's need is guarantee, automatic supply and speed. Tomorrow's need is NATO, permanent deterrence and political umbrella. The first is life support during the war, the second is insurance for the post-war period. The text in Washington is possible within the current political window, but Europe's lock on pre-financing and orders is inevitable. When these two pieces come together, Ukraine's options increase, and Moscow's dream of quick gains becomes costly once again. In short, Trump's shift from ceasefire to permanent agreement both challenges and strengthens Kiev's hand. It challenges because it creates pressure for concrete results in the short term. It strengthens because Europe's open support carries weight at the table. Moscow, meanwhile, will seek to gain diplomatic legitimacy. These initiatives make the text of the guarantees even more critical. NATO's strategic outlook will continue to confirm the post-war membership line. This confirmation emphasizes the temporary nature of the similar umbrella and points to the long-term framework. Do you think Washington can draft the text at a level that cannot be tested this time? The first feedback from the field will provide the answer. We will continue to closely monitor the numbers, headlines, and steps in this process. We look forward to your comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for new analyses. Thank you for watching.